Greetings, everybody. Hello to all of you that are here tonight, and those of you who are watching us online. I know some of you are as far away as east as Cape Cod and as far south as Texas. So, hello to all of you out there. Thank you for coming tonight. And those of you who will be watching this when it's online later on, if you couldn't make it today. Anyway, the Londonderry Conservation Commission is very happy to present this program tonight. I'm Erwin Kuperberg, chair of the Commission, and this is the first of a three-part series that we're going to be offering this winter, and the first of an annual winter three-part series. Tonight we're going to be talking about rivers. Next month we're going to be talking about the last 260 years of agriculture and how it's changed the landscape in Vermont. And then in April we have a talk on wetlands and beavers and what beavers are doing for our landscape. So you'll be hearing more about that. So tonight, rivers. And Londonderry, as I think most towns in Vermont, were built along rivers, and rivers created growth and prosperity, but sometimes it bites us back. So there are all kinds of reasons why that's happened, some of them man-made, and our speakers are going to talk about all of that tonight. And I know that this is a topic of importance. It's very important to everybody in Londonderry because of the problems we've had with flooding. So that's going to be addressed also. So I'm happy to introduce our speakers. Shane Jackwith is Flood Restoration Manager with the Nature Conservancy, and he has spoken for us before, 2 or 3 years ago, I think it was.
Yeah, you must have been right before COVID.
Yeah, yeah. So he led us on a lovely walk down by Riverside and showed us all kinds of things that go on there and explained using the river as an actual teaching tool of what happens with rivers. And tonight he's going to expand on that, go back and expand on that. And he's accompanied by Sarah Noyes, who's with Sea Grant and also with the Nature Conservancy. So take it away.
Yeah, thanks.
And we'll have a Q&A afterwards for those of you who have questions and want to speak some more to us.
Thanks, Erwin. Yeah, it's good to be back here in London. That get-together we had, I guess that was 2019, I thought it was a great conversation. We had a good crowd. Yeah, we had a good conversation around river management in the state. So again, Shane Jackwith with the Nature Conservancy. I think a lot of you are familiar with Nature Conservancy. I know the Nature Conservancy, the folks in our chapter know Londonderry very well. You know, we are a global conservation organization with a chapter in every state, and then I'd say approximately 20 chapters around the world outside of the U.S. We have about 58 natural areas throughout Vermont, and we've helped conserve a whole bunch of land. A lot of that has been turned over to the state over the years, but you know, that's basically what we do. Our mission globally is to conserve the land and waters on which all life depends. So that's a little bit about the Nature Conservancy. We were fortunate enough to strike a partnership with the Lake Champlain Sea Grant program and help fund a flood resilience educator position. We started into this work a little over a year ago, and through that partnership with the Sea Grant program, we were able to create that flood resilience educator position and hired Sarah Noyes into that position. So Sarah works for both TNC and Sea Grant program, and I'll let Sarah introduce the Sea Grant program a little bit.
Yeah, thanks, Shane. Hi, everyone. My name is Sarah Noyes, and like Shane said, I'm the flood resilience educator with Lake Champlain Sea Grant and the Nature Conservancy. Lake Champlain Sea Grant is a program of the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Association, and the Lake Champlain Sea Grant program is based at UVM, and our mission is to develop and share science-based information that will help benefit economies and the environment in our regional area. So again, thank you guys so much for coming out. We will be focusing today on river corridor protections and how they can help us reduce our exposure to flood hazards. So just to give everyone an outline of what we're going to talk about today, we're going to start with a brief overview of Vermont flood history, and then we're going to explore the different factors that make flooding in Vermont so damaging. And then Shane is going to discuss how we can help to reduce our exposure to flood hazards through floodplain management, and more specifically river corridor protections. Then we'll have time for questions at the end. But before we jump in, does anyone have any questions now? Okay. So as you all may know, Vermont has a long history of large-scale floods. These 5 floods that are up here on the screen right now are recognized by the National Weather Service as our 5 largest floods in the past 150 years or so, starting in 1869 with the All New England flood. That was around the time when National Weather Service started collecting that data, followed by the Great Vermont Flood in 1927, the Great New England Hurricane in 1938, the floods of 1973, and then of course Tropical Storm Irene in 2011. And as we all know, we did experience severe flooding this past year in 2023, but National Weather Service is still cataloging all of that data, so that's why that's not included here. In addition to those large-scale floods, Vermont actually floods on smaller regional scales pretty frequently, and that's what we're trying to illustrate with this diagram here. From the years 1970 to 2011, we have in these different colored circles the areas of the highest concentrated damage from these regional floods. So I guess the biggest takeaway from this image is that while we do have these large-scale floods that the media covers, there are also frequent flooding events on smaller scales that maybe don't get as much attention, but we do live in a place that floods frequently. And the main types of damage that we experience, or the hazards that we experience from flooding, kind of fall into 2 main categories, which we will talk about later. But the first is inundation flooding, which is shown by this image of Montpelier in the top left. Inundation flooding happens when water rises and areas that aren't normally wet become wet. And the second type of hazard is erosion, or it's often referred to as fluvial erosion when we're talking about riverine flooding. And that basically means that fast-moving water will strip away sediment from stream banks, which can be really damaging, especially if there is infrastructure or buildings kind of right on the edge of that stream bank. And as you can see here, sometimes structures can get carried away and roads can get undercut. And 80% of the damage that Vermont experiences from flooding is from erosion. So what are the factors that make our floods so damaging here in Vermont? We're going to talk about the main 3 factors, which are our topography, our precipitation patterns, and then our history of risky development. So Vermont is a very mountainous state. We have lots of steep and narrow river valleys, which results in a lot of steep rivers. And because of this, we often choose to develop in these narrow river valleys and these flat areas right next to our rivers. Our second factor, precipitation trends. So Vermont is considered to have a wet climate. We kind of are dealing with water moving through our system all the time. But that is predicted to increase. Our area is predicted to become wetter going forward. And so that just means we're going to get more frequent precipitation events, and they will be more intense. And of course, these precipitation events are what fuel the flooding. So when that water hits our mountainous topography, that's kind of what exacerbates the flooding. And then our third factor here is risky development. So going back to what we were talking about with the topography, that has kind of forced development in these flatter areas next to rivers because we have so many mountainous hills, and from a construction standpoint, it's easier to develop on a flatter area. But oftentimes these flatter areas around the river are also the most flood-prone areas. This red zone here is showing the extent of the river corridor, which is a high flood hazard area. So So historically, we've done a lot of work to try to protect our developments in these risky areas that have resulted in a lot of unintended consequences that have put us in more danger. So we've kind of taken this control approach to the rivers, basically trying to keep the river in the spot that it was when we developed next to it. So rivers are dynamic beings. They kind of they change where they are all the time, and they tend to take on this meandering pattern you can see in these two photos on the left. But historically, to accommodate either agriculture, or development, or roads, we have tried to straighten the channels, which you can see here in these two examples, kind of the contrast between the shapes of the rivers on the left and then what it looks like now as they're straightened here on the right, both in White River, and this is the Huntington River in Huntington, Shane's hometown. We at the Black Creek. So what happens when we straighten the channel? This actually accelerates the speed of the river. I like to use the analogy of skiing. So when you're skiing down a slope, to slow yourself down, you'll take wide turns. Now imagine you're skiing that same slope, but you're just going straight. You're going to go a lot faster. So it's the same kind of idea with the rivers. When they're meandering, they have lots of opportunity and distance to slow down and dissipate excess water. And when we straighten our channels, they are faster and have more destructive, erosive force, which is more dangerous to buildings, infrastructure, people that can be close to them. And this diagram is just illustrating that as well, that when a river is straightened, the slope is increased, making it more destructive. So another practice that we have adopted historically, trying as a means to try to mitigate our flooding, is dredging, so digging out rivers. And so this example is just showing kind of beforehand, when our banks are low, there's low flow and low velocity. So it's kind of, everything is pretty shallow, the banks are wide, but there's not a lot of speed or destructive force that's able to flow through something that is able to expand out into what is considered to be the floodplain here. But when we dig out or dredge our rivers, the rivers become a lot deeper and they have a lot more velocity, so a lot more destructive force. So again, we're speeding up the power in the river. And this is kind of an interesting concept of, a lot of times dredging will happen in a concentrated area of the river, but the results of dredging, digging out a river, can affect the whole river system. After an area is dredged, a process called head cutting will begin, which actually starts to move upstream, which is kind of counterintuitive, because usually when I think about river impacts, I'm like, oh, what's happening downstream? But this actually works going upstream. So if you think about it, how a waterfall would fall down and start to kind of scour away at the base, it begins to undercut and move backwards over time, which moves essentially up the river. So these management techniques that we've taken in certain areas will impact has a much farther reach than just the area where something was dug out. So in conclusion to this first part of the presentation, our historic land use and channel management activities have resulted in an extensive channel instability. So what's happening in a lot of our streams and rivers in Vermont is that they are taking on this kind of 5-stage channel evolution, where the river begins to insize and the channel becomes deeper, the banks become unstable and start to undercut, so structures on the side will fall in, and then the channel gets widened, and then everything kind of begins again. But this is a very unstable process for our rivers to be going through. And DEC has assessed over 5,000 river miles in Vermont, and 75% are undergoing this channel evolution phase. So this is a big problem. A lot of our rivers in Vermont do not look like or behave like they did before we all came to develop them. So while we can't go back in time and change the decisions that were made in the past, we do have control going forward to make smarter decisions about where we're choosing to develop, and also giving our rivers the room they need to slow down. But there are a lot of opportunities to become more flood resilient through floodplain regulations, which Shane is going to talk about now.
Yeah, thanks. All right. So that little explanation of river dynamics and our channel management development patterns. I'm going to get into a little bit about what, as Sarah said, what we can do moving forward, right? So just to summarize that section of the presentation, we're in a situation in which the combination of our steep mountain topography, narrow valleys, little place to develop, little area of land that's easily developed, leading to sort of risky developments, vulnerable developments, right along the side of rivers that are highly unstable because of this history of channel management, this approach that we've taken of trying to control the river to protect our investments. Those three factors, all magnified by the fact that our precipitation patterns or precipitation events are becoming more intense, right, and predicted to do so immensely. Those factors are all combining to create immense and ever-increasing flood hazards, flood damage, right? Our neighbors, our communities are all feeling the impacts, and the costs are ever increasing. So the question, as Sarah kind of put it, is like, what do we do going forward to deal with this situation that we find ourselves in? Because we can't go back. So historically, Vermont and the U.S. overall has relied on the Federal Emergency Management Agency National Flood Insurance Program and at the NFIP program, right? And I think a lot of you are probably somewhat familiar, have heard of the National Flood Insurance Program. But for those of you that need a refresher or have never been really that familiar with it, we'll just put it in a nutshell or explain it in a nutshell here. Basically what happens is FEMA creates maps that show where areas of flood hazard exist, right? All of our communities, our communities have flood hazard maps created by FEMA. If a town chooses to participate, the town adopts regulations that restricts how development happens in those flood hazard areas. And they regulate based upon a minimum standard established by FEMA. And once they do that, FEMA will provide flood insurance to all of the residents and businesses in that municipality. Now let me back up. I should have said this at the beginning of this slide. The National Flood Insurance Program was created in 1968 in response to the fact that the private insurance sector backed away from providing flood insurance because they were just losing their shirts on flood insurance. So the federal government stepped in to create this federally backed insurance program for individuals that live in flood hazard areas. It's just an insurance program, and it's just based on inundation versus the erosion hazard that Sarah mentioned. And as Sarah just mentioned, the erosion hazard is responsible for 80% of Vermont's flood damage expenses. Not buildings getting wet, but roads and buildings getting undercut by the moving river and falling into the drink, right? So there's some deficiencies here with the National Flood Insurance Program. Additionally, or another deficiency, is the fact that because we are a largely rural state with low population densities, relatively speaking, FEMA has not invested in mapping the flood hazard areas around all of our rivers. So many communities are really lacking. In fact, only somewhere about 12% of rivers have maps with flood hazard data. And I'm not going to get into this too much, it's a little technical, but only approximately 5 to 6% have maps that actually show the floodway, which is I won't get into that, but the point being, a lot of communities around the state just don't have maps. A lot of homeowners don't know that they live in a flood hazard area. A lot of home buyers don't know that they're about to buy a house that's in a flood hazard area, and they might want to look into the cost of flood insurance, right? We're largely moving forward with a big lack of awareness and understanding. Another issue is that even where flood maps exist, and I don't know how well you can see it, my color choice wasn't that great, at least for this screen, but there's an orange corridor here, and there's a yellow corridor here. The yellow corridor represents the FEMA flood insurance hazard area, the area that FEMA predicts could get wet during a large flood event. Like many areas across the state, it doesn't include, or that polygon only includes, again, the inundation area. So it doesn't include this area that sits well above the river and will never get wet from a flood. That house is not in the FEMA flood map. But boy, is it susceptible to flood erosion damage. That is not even considered in the FEMA hazard maps. So that house did not have to get, that homeowner did not have to get flood insurance. And they wish that they had, right? So that's a big missing piece. And again, just to state it in a nutshell, the National Flood Insurance Program doesn't consider erosion hazards, just the hazards associated getting wet. That picture of Montpelier that Sarah showed, right? Everything gets wet, the water goes down, you got to rip out all the drywall for 4 feet up off the floor and deal with everything else, right? That's what it looks at. It does not protect against this sort of hazard. So we have pretty good participation. I think there's only 20 communities shown in pink here throughout the state that don't participate in the National Flood Insurance Program. Looks to me like Londonderry does. So you all can buy flood insurance, whether you live in the flood hazard area or not. I don't know why you would if you didn't live in the flood hazard area, but you can. And so this leaves us feeling like pretty good, right? We're doing a good job. All of our towns are enrolled. We're in the program. But because of the deficiencies I mentioned earlier, we're not really protected the way that we need to be. So what do we need to do moving forward? A lot of people who have thought about this have agreed that what we need to do is actually identify this area that is susceptible to those erosion hazards, the hazards created by the river moving side to side across the landscape. We need to understand where that area is, map it, and limit our development, limit our exposure to risks in those areas. Every time there's a flood and we have to pay for the recovery, I'm sure we all know that money all comes from the taxpayer, right? So moving forward, how can we reduce that, burden on the taxpayer? So that is what has been proposed by the Agency of Natural Resources for a long time, and they've actually mapped these flood hazard areas, or what they call the river corridor. They've done that throughout the state. You can go online and see these river corridor areas mapped, and they have been using those maps. Actually, let me advance the slide because I think I'm getting ahead of myself. No, I'm not, actually. They use these maps currently when they review development under the Act 250 process, right? Whenever the state has to get involved in Act 250, if there's an Act 250 development right here, they pull out their river corridor map and they look to see whether it's in the river corridor or not. They use it to regulate activities that municipalities can't regulate, things like agriculture and forestry. You know, if somebody wants to build a barn in this area, they'll pull out the river corridor map and see if the barn's in the river corridor or not, and make their recommendations based on that. They also have been assisting municipalities that want to choose to limit development in river corridors. And I'll get into that a little bit more. So the point being, the state has started to take the approach, and this is the Agency of Natural Resources, of identifying these river corridors, these hazardous areas that aren't captured by the National Flood Insurance Program, put them on the map and start to use them to inform development decisions. So here's what that looks like. The combination of the National Flood Insurance maps and the river corridor. In the red is the National Flood Insurance flood hazard area. In the yellow is the state mapped river corridor. If a town chooses to adopt river corridor, protect the river corridors or limit development in the river corridors, this is what their maps in their town will look like. You notice in some areas, the river, the floodplain area is really narrow and the river corridor is a lot wider. That's kind of like the area that I showed in that other image with the house sitting perched up on that bluff. You might have a river that's down deep and the water's never going to spread out because the banks are, 15, 20, 25 feet high. But those banks are only made of sands and gravels. If the river decides to do so, it'll easily move through that and take all that down. So that's where the river corridor is wider than the floodplain. In other areas, the floodplain is wider than the river corridor, and that's just an area where you have low banks, and that water can really spread out much further than the river is ever likely to move. Maybe there's bedrock or something along this section that will never allow the river to move way out here. But of course the water can rise up over that bedrock and just, and spread out if it's low enough, right? So they're different, but together they provide the comprehensive protection that we really need. And I think that's been proven time and time again with all of the flooding we've had. So, and this is a little bit of a pitch. we do have an interest. If municipalities choose to, they can protect their river corridors. It's a matter of adopting the zoning language in your land use regulations, your zoning bylaws, however you refer to them. Again, the river corridors are mapped by the state. The towns adopt the zoning language, and the state has developed a model zoning language that is completely compatible with the National Flood Insurance Program language. And it's not that easy because the NFIP FEMA program is highly bureaucratic. So to put these two together and get them to work together without creating issues is really complicated. So the state has spent a lot of time developing language so that those two regulatory approaches fit and work together. And they can provide that language to you. And if the town chooses to adopt the river corridor protections, because the town is in essence reducing its flood risk and the state's flood risk, the state rewards that by providing the town a greater percentage in the cost share when there's a disaster declaration. So I don't know if any of you are familiar with the Emergency Relief Assistance Fund, known as ERAF for short, but that's the fund that the state uses during a disaster declaration to offset the local cost share that the feds don't provide. The feds typically come in and provide 75% of the cost to recover from a disaster, a declared disaster. The state has long had this ERAF fund, and it kicks in, I believe, normally 12%. If the town has the road and bridge standards, which I think Sarah learned that Londonderry has adopted road and bridge standards, then the state ups their contribution to like 15%. And then if the town adopts the river corridor protections on top of that, the state ups their share to 17.5%, I believe it is. So the cost to the town to recover from flood damage is reduced. And again, it makes sense, right? Like that town, has taken steps to reduce Vermont's overall exposure to flood risk, let's incentivize that and reward that, because it's financially beneficial to the state and the taxpayers of the state. So that option is there for municipalities. Sarah and I, as part of what we're doing together, we are more than happy, would be more than happy to talk in more detail with the Planning Commission, the Select Board, the DRB, whoever it might be. If there are people that are thinking, yeah, this might be a good idea for Londonderry, let's learn some more about it. We're happy to help. And we can't answer all your questions, but we can probably answer a lot of your questions and then put you in contact with the right people to answer the rest of your questions. We'd certainly be happy to do that. So the state has been working to get towns signed up for river corridor protections, I think going back to 2008. And what we have is about a 10% of the towns in the state adopting. It's really only the yellow towns that have adopted, and again, the color choice, I don't know, for me, it's not showing up very distinctly, but there's only about 10 towns on this map that have adopted river corridor protections. The orange towns have adopted some sort of interim protection, but they don't typically go anywhere. They don't typically proceed and adopt the full corridor protection. So let's say 10% of the municipalities have gone through and adopted river corridor protection since about 2008. So we're not doing very good. And what we hear over and over again is that, and I understand it because I was on my town's planning commission and I know the zoning administrator and I know the town administrator. What we hear is that it's a great idea, but boy, are we already burdened with doing everything we do, and our zoning administrator is already, completely overworked trying to do what they do. The floodplain program already is really difficult and complex. We're not sure we want to add this layer on top of that. We hear that over and over again. So with that in mind, that's not really showing up the way it's supposed to. TNC and another number of other organizations, I'll go back to that. TNC and another number of other organizations have been promoting statewide adoptions of river corridor protections or limitation of development in river corridors, where the state floodplain management program would administer the whole thing. They have the maps, they would have the regulations, they would be the police, and they would do the whole thing. Last year, there was a bill introduced into the House. I think it was H29. It got kicked around quite a bit, looked promising for a while, and it was a bill to have the state take over the river corridor protections. Ultimately, it died, I think, in the Senate. This year, probably not surprising after July and August, that idea was reintroduced, and it's now been introduced into the Senate. It's not 219, it's 213, that's my error. It's S213, it's in the Senate, and after July and August, it is getting serious consideration. I heard today that it went through a markup session and came through that session pretty unscathed. Those markup sessions are where proposed legislation can really get hammered, modified, but it looks like it's got a lot of support. Senate Bill 213 is a revision of the flood hazard area and the river corridor rule. This is kind of jargony, but basically to incorporate statewide jurisdiction and permitting authority for floodplains and river corridors as recommended by the Vermont Clean Action Plan, or Climate Action Plan. And it establishes a process to map appropriate infill. That's jargony. Basically, it's for the state to take it over, right? That's the idea. The towns are overburdened. If we really think this is important, let's pass it at the state level. So, again, we and others are promoting that, and it seems to be moving along. Whether it gets across the governor's desk, I think, is really uncertain. And, Governor Scott has his reasons. At the same time, he has stood up after the floods of this summer, and he has said that we need to deal with this issue. So I think he's, he recognizes the issue and the importance of it, but he also has his principles, right? And things that he thinks are important. So what happens in the end, hard to say, but it's really getting a lot of support in the legislature right now. TNC just did, I think these results came out last week, maybe the week before, just did some polling on this idea of support for this idea of introducing statewide, state-administered floodplain management, river corridor protection. And there's a whole bunch of results. There's like a report with like, I don't know, 25 different questions and all the stats on the responses to all the questions. That would really put everybody to sleep pretty quick. So if I had to pick one, I think this is the result that tells the story. And that is that there is bipartisan support. 67% of the 500 polled persons supported. 67%. It was bipartisan polling. It breaks out to 80% support by Democrats and 57% support by independents and 57% support by Republicans. The pollers said they never see bipartisan support like this for proposed legislation. This is very strong support. So, of course, as one of the organizations advocating for this, we were happy to see that. So that seems to be where the public will is right now for this idea. And that is really the conclusion of the presentation. I just threw this in there. I think I had it on another slide too, but a little bit bigger here. This is a really nice graphic, I think, that conveys the idea. This is on the Flood Ready website, or that website that was created after Irene in 2012. It's still there, the website. One of the nice things that came out, this is a nice graphic that came out of it, but the idea being that, we have these areas outside of this blue river corridor, this erosion hazard area, that really are safe and appropriate for development. And let's do our dense development in those areas. And where things aren't safe, let's keep those in agriculture. Let's keep those in other land uses where we're not making really big investments that are risky. And let's maintain a resilient landscape where there's space for dynamic natural processes. And as resilient communities, let's learn and adapt from what we keep experiencing to reduce our flood risk. I will add that, and I didn't have this in the slide, I'm just realizing it now, this is important because we're sitting here in a village right on the river with people that live right on this river, and there's probably plans for continued dense development in this village, maybe not, right, a lot of villages. This whole idea of protecting river corridors respects that we have village areas that are already in these river corridors, and we will respect the idea that we need to continue to develop in those areas, and towns have wanted to do that. We will come in and we will armor, we will channelize, we will do whatever we have to do to protect the development in those areas, as long as at the same time we're not creating more risk. Because if we leave these areas to absorb all this erosion energy and allow this water to rise up on these floodplains, we greatly reduce the risk, the energy to these downstream villages. So we can balance those two, and we can respect those existing development patterns. We have to, right? There's no political will for doing otherwise. So that's all baked into this proposal. And that's really the end of our presentation on river dynamics, the history of river management, flood risk, and how we might work to mitigate all of those risks and hazards. And we'd love to just spend some more time having a free-form conversation. So happy to take questions.
We have a dam in the town of Londonderry.
Yeah.
And just wondering how that fits into this.
Dams are, for us as a conservation organization, almost entirely separate issue. We actually had, we don't anymore, but we had, I had a colleague who worked specifically on dams. So, do you have are you thinking there's a connection there that we ought to be thinking about? Or, like, we know that we have many villages with dams, And whether you adopt a river corridor protection or not, I don't think that influences any conversations about whether to keep or remove the dam. Not apparent to me, not intentionally. Maybe unintentionally there's implications there, but if you can think of some.
Well, it's just like the dam holds back the water so that it then runs down the main street of the village.
So it's creating a flood hazard. And that inundation hazard, the water's coming up and spreading out.
Right.
And yes, and so that is an issue.
But at the same time, is the dam slowing down the flow of the water so that maybe it's providing a benefit there?
Yeah, and I don't want to get myself in trouble, but in some cases, that dam's also controlling the grade of the river, right? Like that slide that Sarah showed where this channel evolution process occurs. It was her last slide. Like, the problem we get into, the way we got into this, well, one of the ways we got into this problem is where when we settled this landscape, we started building houses and made other investments in these beautiful, flat, well-drained areas, right? Wow, you can't get better area for development, right? Like, especially in this state. But then, after a few years, we noticed that we were getting flooded every couple of years. So then, we put the berms in. And the berms disconnected the river from really what is its blow-off valve. That's the energy dissipation device in this whole system, that floodplain, right? The water spreads out, it gets slow, right? All the energy is dissipated across this broad landscape. Well, when you build the berms to keep the water in that channel, all that energy goes to work on the bed, and that channel goes straight down, and then you get into this widening situation, and then the houses start coming in, right? So having the bed of the river up high, close to the floodplain is actually good, and that flooding, this is the issue. We've converted our flooding problem, we've traded our flooding problem, our inundation problem, for an erosion problem. Right? We got rid of the flooding by putting in the berms, but then we got the erosion, right? So it's a double-edged sword, balancing the pros and cons. So the dam's getting everybody wet upstream, but at the same time, the dam is actually holding the riverbed up high, close to the top of the bank, so that the water can spread out and slow down, and the energy can be dissipated. So there's a little bit of a tension there. Yeah. What do we do with that scenario?
Have you walked our corridor and really looked at, we have an interesting dynamic where the Utley Brook feeds into the West River. And so at that convergence, you actually get water pushing upstream and then spreading out.
Yeah.
So some of the flooding that occurs is from the actual back push of the Utley Brook.
Yeah.
So, I mean, I know that we have the corridor studies actually happening and in our area, and it will be available to us in September, which I think would be great information. But how frequently do you see situations like that?
Yeah, confluences are very tricky areas. So a lot of these maps are created using hydraulic models, right? Modeling, they take the shape of the river, they put it in the computer, they put the slope of the river in the computer, they put some other factors in there, then they run different volumes of water through that model in the computer, and they see how high the water gets, and then they see how far it spreads out, and they draw the lines, and there's your flood map. Where you have the convergence of two rivers, those two flows of water, like you said, particularly where one's bigger than the other, that bigger river backs up the smaller stream, and that water backs up, and they're difficult areas to predict what's going to happen. So that is a challenge for that inundation hazard that Sarah talked about, where the water comes up and spreads out, right? So I don't know what the maps are going to look like, the FEMA. Maybe when you say the corridor study, you're talking about the new flood maps that you're supposed to get, right? I believe that's...
We had a flood mitigation meeting on Monday, and the Agency of Natural Resources, the corridor plan for the West River, it's supposed to be completed in April, and it's the Weston, Londonderry, Jamaica sections.
Yeah, so they're doing a river corridor plan. Is that right?
Yes.
Okay, so that'll be really informative. I have not seen that. I'm not aware of it, but that'll be really informative to you. But what else do you want me to say? Is there something else you want me to say?
No, I mean, I didn't know how often the convergences actually
Yes, that's
are.
a common, very common scenario, and they create a lot of problems. I can think of like the town of Johnson, the brook that comes off of Madonna, Smuggler's Notch area, comes down into Lamoille, and man, is it a mess. That convergence, that confluence there, it's a huge, the whole village gets inundated, and it's because of that same issue. Yeah. So it's really good you guys are working to get a river corridor plan put together, and I think that's going to be really helpful, and you're going to learn a lot, and hopefully a lot of recommendations come out of that. Yeah.
Related to that, have you seen where normally you can't really touch the path of the river, but in that situation where there's a backup or something, have you seen where towns can alter the path of the river to remediate that?
Yeah, I don't know that, you could dredge that out, lower the bed of the river, right, so you have more capacity. And that's what we've historically done, right? That's what Sarah talked about with our historic, activities, our sort of command and control approach, keep the water in the channel. But you get that head cutting process that Sarah described. That's the job of the Agency of Natural Resources River Management Engineer, to come into that specific site, look at it, and say, maybe evaluate the amount of sediment that comes down. If there's a tremendous amount of sediment coming down that brook, that person might say, yeah, we can dredge a little bit here because we'll get more gravel to come down and replace what we took out. It's not like we're going to get a head cutting scenario. So it's a case by case basis, and that's the river management engineer's job. And I think they do a good job of that. They really try to balance. It's hard for them, right? They try to balance these erosion hazards. At the same time, they know that doing things like dredging are likely, many cases, going to cause more issues, but they recognize that not doing anything might mean that a structure adjacent or a roadway adjacent is going to fall in the drink within the next couple of years or get flooded out repeatedly. So it's challenging. I think it's on a case-by-case basis that those decisions are made.
So this is about that same confluence. I'm the select board chair at Town Kavanaugh. And I've found a scientific study that says, because right now those two rivers come in at about a 90 degree.
Yeah.
I found a scientific study that says if you change that angle, lessen that angle, you can control the backwater by up to 54%.
Yeah.
And I am trying to work with Scott Jensen from A&R.
And how's that going?
I haven't heard back from him. I sent him the study.
Okay.
And I've checked in with him a couple times, but
Yeah.
have you seen anything like that done?
I'm sure it is. I can't think of a specific instance where I've seen it done, but that doesn't mean that's not, because I'm not in a position of really keeping my eye on that sort of thing. I think Scott would be the better, but absolutely, you get the convergence of two fluids coming together, right? In a low angle, they're going to converge much more smoothly than, and the opposite being, right, you start against, that's going to be the worst scenario. As you decrease that angle, that's not a good scenario still. You get lots of back eddies, right? You get that seam of water where they are coming together. And as you change that convergence angle, it's going to improve it. You're absolutely, yeah. So I think it's a great idea, and working with Scott is the right thing to do.
So, we'll keep our eyes on it.
I had a question about the map that showed 74% more precipitation. Was that over so many years, or I didn't understand what I was referring to?
That came from the National Climate Assessment, and how many years? Yes, right. Good question. I think Sarah, you had that right on yours, and bigger, so we can actually see it. Yeah. So what is that? Percent increase from 1958 to 2011 in the amount of precipitation falling in very heavy events, and I think they define very heavy events as more than a certain number of inches within 24 hours, right? There's a definition, but yeah, this comes out of it actually comes from Climate Central, but Climate Central took it from the National Climate Assessment. And so that's actually not a prediction going forward, that's just what we've seen already.
Increasing sounded like projection.
Yeah, but all predictions, and I've seen different sort of presentations of the same idea that intensity of precipitation is just going up. I think, was it most recently was a study out of, I keep wanting to say Cornell, but that's in New York, of course, New Hampshire, Dartmouth. I don't know if you saw that same study, but that it looked at flood costs, and like over the next 100 years, costs are going to increase by like, flood damage costs are going to increase by something astronomical. The UVM did a similar sort of thing not too long ago. It's just the outlook is just really not good because, you know, the precipitation patterns are just getting so energized. Yeah.
This isn't really a question, but it seems clear to me that like we're gonna need some kind of heavy hand or like some more statewide role in all this to force towns to work together, because it's so clear that, you know, like this channelizing or whatever, like whatever we're doing upstream has these huge impacts downstream. I'm an upstream town from Londonderry, and like it's so clear we have to work together to try to soften what's going on.
Yeah.
And we need, like, our individual towns need help and
Yeah.
need help and maybe need to be pushed to
Yeah.
work together somehow. And
Yeah.
we're not particularly good at that, but
Yeah. Is your comment, you
I'm
respond?
happy.
Yeah, go.
Weston, Jamaica, and Londonderry have formed a committee to
Yeah.
start looking at a regional approach,
that's great.
Yeah.
and we'll keep working on it.
And I know the Wyndham Regional Commission, they're very active around flood hazard mitigation and your regional approach that you mentioned.
They're helping us out too.
They might be helping with that. So yeah, and you know, we really have learned, and I worked for the A&R Rivers program, Scott Jensen's program. I provided scientific support to the river engineers. I've worked for that program for 16 years. I traveled around the state after Irene helping VTrans assess damage. I did trainings for VTrans for about 3 years and municipal road crews. And we really have learned, I think I was on the slide and I just moved away from it, that, you know, all of this stuff, like it's that model where the river downcuts. I remember I got hired in 1998 and the head engineer of the program had been working in that program for probably 25 years at that time. And we found this in some scientific study, like we were starting to expose ourselves, moving away from just strict engineering, because that's where this has always been. This has been the domain of the engineer. How much rock and how big does that rock need to be to hold the river where it is? And the head engineer saw this diagram and he said, "Holy bleep. I have seen so many rivers like that, and I have just told the crews to add more rock. And all I was doing was holding those banks up so that that river could cut down even further. That's all we were doing. And those rivers continued to cut down until finally they just got underneath the rock. And the whole failure, the width of the whole failure is just that much wider because, of course, the further down the thing goes, the further out the erosion happens once it starts going, right? We really have learned that command and control approach, it's just costing us more and more money. So we do need to do something, and the states, like, we really need to get back to this. And in order to get back to this, we need to let the rivers do what they do within that corridor. Because when they move to the side, what ends up, they're moving back and forth, and they take out this high bank that they've created, and then they rebuild a new floodplain at the lower elevation. So we really need to let those rivers go through that back and forth movement and rebuild that floodplain, rebuild that pressure relief valve in the system. And there's many urban areas that are looking at these incised, these rivers that have gone through this, and they're, okay, this is the no-touch zone. That's the area where the river needs to move around, and then we're going to give it back that area. In Vermont, we still have a lot of land that's like this, and if we can get back up to these wider areas, we can dissipate that much more energy. Once you get here, this is a narrower valley bottom, and your energy dissipation is not quite as great because the water can't spread out as much. So we're trying to, access as much of the floodplain as we can and the river corridor as we can, but it's where we exist in this context of being here and settling this landscape, in the early 1700s, and we have to work within the development patterns that we have, so we can't always reach the ideal condition, and we do what we can. But you're absolutely right, like working together, what happens upstream affects downstream, and as Sarah showed by that head cutting thing, like the reason we like to talk about that is because as Sarah said, most people don't think about, what you do downstream can actually have implications for upstream. And that's exactly what happens. You dredge enough in one area, and for miles upstream, you might get this head cutting happening, which leads you from here to there. It disconnects the river from the floodplain. And you might hear a lot about that, floodplain river connectivity. That's just describing this scenario where the river's really well connected to the floodplain and the water can spread out on that floodplain versus this incised scenario where the river's disconnected from the floodplain.
Is there any movement actually to go upstream and try to create a more winding path for the rivers, or is that
an option?
Yeah,
Solution?
manipulating them that way? I mean, if you go north on 100, there's a lot of open fields right along the West River.
Yeah.
And then if you go up into Landgrove, Utley Brook has fields all around it. Do they ever go in and actually try to slow the rivers down, or is that?
Yeah, we do. I have been involved in some of that. Where you come in here and you excavate this all down to here so it looks like this when you leave. That's one thing that's one approach. It's expensive, right? It's super expensive. Another thing you can do is go in here, and where there's room for the river to move, you start putting structure. One of the things that we've done to our rivers is removed all of the hard structure, and that's big trees that have fallen in the river. We all know trees create problems where we have nearby developments, but a river channel is not a river channel without large wood structure, just like your house isn't a house if you don't have your 2x6s in your walls, providing that structure to hold your walls together. And we don't know that because all the wood was removed from our rivers long before we got here. But there's a lot of effort to put wood structure back in rivers, and actually, you think about it, they act like dams, and you start trapping that sediment, and the bed starts to build up and up and up. But if you're going to do that, you can't have development, and the way to stop development so that we can do that is to protect our river corridors from more development. Once we get them protected, then we don't have any conflicts, then we can do those sorts of things that, there's going to be some river movement, but over time, we're going to reconnect to that floodplain and get that energy dissipation valve back.
Is there any grant opportunities for what Mark was talking about, dropping the land down?
Are there opportunities?
Grant opportunities.
Oh, grant opportunities. There are. Yes.
We have a town-owned piece of property that is in the floodplain. Mm-hmm. And I've been thinking that's a good spot to drop down. We have some private properties in various places up by the rescue squad, like Mark was saying, that if you drop that down to about a foot above the river, you got a lot of flood storage.
Yeah. That might be the type of thing that's identified in the river corridor plan, one of these restoration type opportunities, but if it doesn't come up and it hasn't been identified, when you talk to whoever you're working with on the river corridor plan, you want to bring that idea up, that would be a good place to do it, because there is the phosphorus reduction money will pay for that, because when you reconnect the river to the floodplain, you're creating a place for the river to dump a tremendous amount of sediment, right? And we know all that sediment has phosphorus bound to it. That's one of the primary approaches that we are supporting to reduce phosphorus is by creating river floodplain reconnections so that the river can rise up and dump sediments onto the floodplain instead of transporting them all the way down to the lake.
Yeah, that was mentioned to Marie Cardillo at a joint town meeting the other day.
Yeah.
Western Jamaica and Londonderry.
Yeah.
I think I know the answer, but is there anything being done to address knotweed growth, which is basically supplanting all the vegetative control of erosion?
Yeah. Sarah may or may not know more about that than I do. I know a little bit. Have you been delving into knotweed at all? I don't know
Not
if you
much.
have. Yeah. So is there anything being done to control it? I think at the state level, the most recent effort I've seen is coming out of Fish and Wildlife Department, and they have like a half-time staff or maybe a full-time staff dedicated to dealing with invasive management, and knotweed being one of those. There's a website, they have a pretty good website that I don't think existed even like 3 or 4 years ago on invasive management control. That's coming out of the agency, and they do, and the neatest thing that I saw for knotweed recently was, and it's on that website, is, and I've done a lot in my career trying to deal with knotweed, and I'm not in that role anymore, but I once was. The newest thing that I've seen that's neat, I don't know, maybe expensive, I don't know how viable it is at larger scales, but this idea of taking wire mesh, like, 1/4 inch, 1 inch grid wire mesh, really thin, really malleable, rolling that out and staking that down, and the knotweed will grow up through those mesh holes, but then as it grows and gets wider, it just girdles itself on the wire. It just all gets girdled. I know, it's cool, isn't it? Right, I know, I saw that, I was like, oh, that's a cool idea. I don't know what the long-term success has been, or how it's been. I didn't delve into it too deeply, but yeah, I think it's a neat idea. So that's a Vermont Fish and Wildlife Department website, invasive management website. And
You need a lot of mesh.
what's that?
You need a lot of mesh.
Yeah, you do, right, you need a lot of, right, so how viable is a large scale, right, and I think that's what we run into with invasive management, it just becomes so overwhelming. Yeah.
A large portion of our river in our town is already occupied with knotweed.
Yeah.
And moving downstream all the time.
Yeah, no, I know, and sometimes I feel like I'm just closing my eyes to it because it's so discouraging. It's probably not the right thing to do. Like the ostrich putting my head in the sand, I guess. Yeah, but I will say, if we can get back to more natural systems and the rivers can move and the waters can flood, overall we're restoring the vigor of that ecosystem and those species, those native species within that ecosystem. We fight reed canary grass on a lot of our preserves. We have a few that are fallow ag lands, and of course there's reed canary everywhere, and we fight it. And we've been reading a bit, and there's a school of thought out there that focus on restoring the ecosystem so that all of the native species have as much vigor and as chance, and let them push out the invasives. I don't know, I think that's a school of thought, how well it works, with what species, what invasives will it work or not, but let's get these fields wet and flooded again, and get the soils back to the soil moisture regime back to what they were. Get the native plants back to more increased vigor, and give them more of a fighting chance. I think that's a logical part of the solution. So I think this kind of helps in that with that idea.
To get those wetlands back where the rivers can do their oxbows and all those things, do we have to think about relocation of buildings that are there, so that we don't have to keep putting energy and resources into redoing them?
Yeah, I would go back to that very last
Right.
slide, well, I think it's a bigger picture right there, yeah. So the idea of river corridor protections doesn't remove existing conflicts. We often refer to them as conflicts or constraints on the river movement. It just stops us from continuing to develop, right? And that's super important because we all hear about the housing crisis every day. We all know that people are moving to the state at ever increasing rate, and there's going to be a lot of pressure to develop wherever we can. So acknowledging that we shouldn't be developing in these places anymore is the first step. With respect
And then
to,
are we mapping public land that can be developed?
yeah, that is the next question, right? Like if we're not going to develop these areas, where do we develop? And I think that's a really important question. And our philosophy on that is how to get there is that, you know, in a democratic society, you know, a messy democratic decision-making planning processes that we all engage in, it's hard to get to question two if you're not if you're not forced to get to it. So let's take this step, protect our river corridors, and then force ourselves to have that next conversation, which is, okay, we can't develop these river corridors anymore. Where are we gonna put our housing? Where are we gonna grow our food? You know, I kind of do this thing all the time. I'm driving around, I'm looking at, you know, I'm seeing these high terraces, and I'm just wondering to myself, why aren't we developing up there? Why are we growing food down here? You know, I love agriculture. I have friends that are in agriculture. Huntington's an agricultural, my hometown's Huntington. We have a lot of agriculture in Huntington. And, you know, why is my friend who's always fighting the river, you know, why can't we get him that land up there to grow food on, right? So, but I think we have to force that conversation by taking this step. We do work with FEMA a lot to buy out homes that are flood damaged. You've all probably heard the reports, you know, on the news since July of different efforts to help buy people out. And I think that's critically important. I think psychologically, those people must go under tremendous amounts of stress. Like, I can't imagine going through multiple flood events. I worked with a farm once to do a floodplain. We call them a floodplain cut project, where we come in and excavate the floodplain down. Farmers up in Fairfield, the farm family, they were so frustrated and had been frustrated. My supervisor had known this farm for, you know, I've been dealing with this farm for like 20 years, and they had been continuously calling him, you know, we want to dredge the river, we want to armor the river, we want to straighten the river. You know, like every year, we're losing our barn, we're losing our fence line, we're losing our cattle path, you know, we're losing the cow pathway. And finally, we really engaged them, and we explained that whole channel evolution model. We sat down at their kitchen table. I must have met with them like 10 to 15 times. We were great friends by the time we had all of our conversations, and they finally agreed, okay, we'll let you come in and cut the floodplain down. We'll give up a little bit of our marginal pasture. It's pretty marginal anyway. Do your floodplain cut thing, let the river move side to side, but the river doesn't go any further than here and here. So we did that, we fenced that off, and where the river was getting close, we rocked it. We put riprap on there and prevented it from going any further. And, you know, we did all that. And the last conversation I had with them, this project was like in 2006, so I think the last conversation I had was like in 2012. And Carolyn Boomhauer was the matriarch of the farm, and she was a great lady. I called her and I said, Carolyn, I haven't been up, I haven't visited, just wondering how the river's doing. And she said, Shane, I don't know. All I know about that river is what my grandson tells me about how many frogs he catches down there. The river's down there, it's in all those trees you put down there, it's doing its thing, it's not against my barn, it's not taking out my fence line. I don't know, it all seems fine to me. And like, just the mental shift from dealing and fighting that river. My boss, my initial boss grew up in Danville on a farm, and he told me, he said, you're gonna see it. They get so involved with fighting the river that they forget about keeping the barn up, they forget about the animal, you know, keeping the animals up, they forget about everything else except fighting that river. And I saw it. We took that whole conflict away from them, and she said, I focus on my animals, I focus on my infrastructure, and that my grandson goes and plays in the river, right? So I think for people who live on rivers and go through flood events, it's got to be a tremendous social, psychological strain that we can mitigate and work ourselves away from.
So I understand the concept of allowing the river to run its course and do its thing. And we do have some FEMA buyouts that have already taken place, but how can we allow the river to do its thing when we have state highway that runs right through the middle of that?
Yeah.
So when do they get
We
involved
don't.
and move the
The
highway?
river doesn't get to do its thing when there's a state highway. These river corridor maps, the river corridor often ends at, the river corridor typically in a flat valley, a broad flat valley is typically 6 channel widths wide. That's just a general rule of thumb, the way we like to explain it. So if the river's, I better use easy numbers or I'll expose my lack of mathematical prowess. So if the river's 50 feet wide, it's 150 feet this side and 150 feet this side of the river. Now, if before you get out that 150 feet, you hit the toe of the valley wall, the hill slope, then it stops there. If you hit a highway, it stops there. It doesn't keep going. So we're acknowledging we're not going to move state transportation infrastructure. If we can, let's say we only get 100 feet on this side, and we're really going for 100 feet in this direction, and on this side we have a bunch more, we'll tack that other 150 feet on that side. Because the idea is that the river needs this width, and this comes from research that's been done around the world on rivers that are more stable. And it's like that 6 channel width seems to be like the magic width that rivers need to adjust over time. They adjust to increases, long-term changes in precipitation, right? They'll adjust to that. If all of a sudden we have a bunch of erosion events in the watershed, they'll adjust to that because you get these sediment inputs coming in, and that's going to change the river. All of a sudden you get more and more water coming in. When we pave areas, like that whole stormwater issue. The reason we regulate stormwater is because we're trying to stabilize the hydrologic regime to the river channel to minimize the amount of adjustment, because the river adjusts every time you change something in the watershed. And it's really going back to that whole slope issue, where if the river increases its length, it's decreasing, the slope of the river is decreasing, so the power is decreasing. And of course, to increase its length, it needs to go side to side across the valley, like Sarah explained, like the skier, right? As Sarah explained. So we need to give it the room to do that, so it can decrease power when it needs to, and it can increase its slope and increase power when it needs to. But we're not gonna give up our state transportation infrastructure. In every case, I have heard discussions within the walls of VTrans that have gone something like, and this was after I read, like, geez, maybe that road just really can't be there. I almost fell out of my chair. But I have heard those discussions. So we are slowly coming around. And there may be areas where it makes sense, right? Where it's really easy to locate a state highway, right? It's not, there's a nice place to put it. The route still is, a good route. Maybe it makes sense in some cases, but probably, 90% of the cases, right? We're going to respect the existing footprint of the state infrastructure. Yeah. Transportation infrastructure. And I think mostly for town roads too, right? Like how many town roads can we think of that would really be easy to move? Probably not many. Right, so. We've worn you down.
Okay. Well, thank you. Thank
Yeah.
you very much. We got a long drive ahead, and they're going way back up north tonight. So,
Yeah.
thanks
Sorry.
very much.
There's coffee on the way.
Yeah, great idea. Yeah. All right, thank you.
Thank you, everybody.